Hello, thank you so much for joining me on The Same Drugs. I'm really looking forward to talking with you. I'm so appreciative of your work. I think it's incredible. It's incredibly brave, and I feel like there's very few people doing it. So I'm grateful to you for that, for sure.
Oh, thanks for having me on, and I look forward to our conversation.
So tell me a bit. I mean, I've read two of your books, one on sex trafficking, and then recently I actually listened to your book on the cobalt mines in the Congo, and both are really, they're really dark subjects. They're really hard to think about, which is probably in part why so many don't think about it very much. I'm curious to know what drew you to these subjects in the first place.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, but I've been doing research on various forms of modern day slavery and child labor and human trafficking for more than 2 decades now, going back to the my first research trip in the summer of 2000. And it was kind of a winding journey into that subject. It's certainly not what I thought I would be doing when I was a high schooler or even in college, but it was a college experience that laid the foundation for this journey. I went to undergrad at Duke University and put together a project there in the early 90s to volunteer in a refugee camp in the former Yugoslavia, which at the time was undergoing a great deal of violence and horror. And I felt I just needed to go and try to contribute in some way. And so I put together this project and spent the summer in a Bosnian refugee camp, and immediately realized I was completely in over my head. I was ill-equipped to handle anything that was going on, other than the one thing that I could do by virtue of being there, which was listen. And I listened to stories, horror stories of genocide, and there was a certain tale that kept recurring, and that's what stuck with me, and eventually put me on this journey, um, which is stories of Serbian soldiers who would go into Bosnian villages, execute the men, and then round up women and girls and take them to rape camps and traffic them across the Balkan region. And some years later, I never really fully processed those stories. I was kind of young at the time, didn't even understand what I was being told. But that laid the foundation for my desire to investigate more into the world of human trafficking, and which I started in 2000. And that from there, the journey continues.
What is human trafficking? I ask this question not to, not to assume that everyone doesn't know, but I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what trafficking is. I think that when we say trafficking, people are imagining physical kidnapping, for example, and then forced slavery, which is, it is forced slavery, but it looks different in different circumstances. And sex trafficking happens, it's almost more subtle than that often.
Yeah, here's what human trafficking is not. It's not what you see in a Hollywood movie, for sure. That's kind of the sensationalized version of it. Here, the way to think about it is like this: um, if you recruit, harbor, transfer a person through some kind of force, fraud, or coercion, some deceptive means or coercive means, into a condition of forced labor or forced service of some kind, then that's what human trafficking is. And there are international definitions that sort of encapsulate those elements of recruiting, the fraud or coercion, and then the forced labor or forced service, whatever it might be. So the Atlantic slave trade was, the most ambitious, audacious, multi-century human trafficking operation in history. I mean, it was exactly that. Coercively acquiring and transporting people from Africa across the Atlantic into forced labor and slavery. But that kind of exploitation continues to this day. Now, it could be that some poor person in a village in a rural area is recruited and brought to a big city and then forced to work in a restaurant or a hotel or a brothel without pay and under threat of violence, or they could be transported halfway around the world. Um, uh, but you have to have the output, the outcome, the end of the journey has to be human trafficking is, and it doesn't. It's very rarely, grabbing someone off the street, throwing them in the back of a truck, and driving off with them. It's more often a simple offer to migrate or to have a job opportunity in another country, because there are so many poor people, grindingly poor people, and disadvantaged people around the world that the mere possibility of going to another country to work and being promised certain wages is enough inducement for them to say yes, and then the trafficker has them.
Mm. And when you began your research on sex trafficking, where did that take you?
A lot of dark places is the short answer. The long answer is dozens of countries around the world where I saw the same theme play out again and again and again, even if it were countries separated by 10,000 miles and completely different cultures and different circumstances. And that theme was, and it's the enduring theme of slavery writ large, that theme was that women and girls, by the hundreds of millions, live in worlds that are utterly disadvantageous, in fact, hostile. They're subjected to violence, oppression, lack of rights, lack of opportunities, lack of education, and waves of gender-based violence for which there's no recourse. And that's the stepping stone into forced prostitution. So if you're living in a world where you are subjected to gender-based violence on a daily basis, or you're in a war zone and gender-based violence is being used as a tool of terror, an act of war, you're desperate to get out of there. If you live in a place where you can't go to school, you never got an education, you're married off, you're being beaten every day, whatever it is, there's so many forces of violence that hundreds of millions of women and girls have to face each and every day. And traffickers prey on that. They know that there are so many desperate, poor, disadvantaged, oppressed people who are easy pickings to say, well, I can get you, working and you can stand on your own 2 feet in this country over here where you'll have rights and you can make it on. And then the trafficker has them. So women and girls, especially because of a lack of education, are so heavily disadvantaged in so many parts of the world. And so I saw that in Albania, Nepal, Moldova, Mexico, Bangladesh, Brazil. I mean, wherever I went, that same theme kept playing itself out. And I considered myself a fairly educated person, fairly, well-read, and had some sense of the world, but I never understood until I went from one country to another how enormously disadvantageous female gender is for most women and girls around the world.
Yeah, and I think that when people in the West think about sex trafficking, which I don't think they do very often, I think when they do, they think about places like Africa and India. I don't think people realize how big the problem of sex trafficking is in Europe, and I certainly don't think that they realize what's happening like in the U.S.
Absolutely. It's not just a poor country problem. Of course, it is that, because that's where women and girls face the most severe disadvantages. But there are vulnerable women and girls in Western Europe, in North America, US and Canada. One of the things I found doing research in the United States for instance, was the foster care system was an on-ramp into trafficking for forced prostitution. I mean, if they weren't being recruited while they were in the system, because of course the system, it's there. It's better that there's a foster care system than not, but it has so many problems and it's so unpalatable for so many young girls. They were recruited out of it. But the big thing was the minute you age out, because that day comes, usually it's on your 18th birthday. The minute you age out, suddenly in most states in the United States and in most countries in the West, the protections, the rights, it's gone. And you're kind of on your own. And technically, you're supposed to have a transition period and a caseworker and all of these things that sort of transition you. But oftentimes, it's overworked caseworkers who have 500 cases for 8 hours in the day, and they can't keep track. And so suddenly, you don't have a place to live. You probably don't have a job. And traffickers were there. They're Johnny on the spot. One of the things I tell people is, whenever there's a catastrophe, a crisis, war, environmental disaster, or someone ages out of foster care, whatever it is that is that pivot to vulnerability, the first responder is traffickers. Because they know that they can, it's a numbers game for them. They can approach 10 and get 2, and 100 means 20 and 1,000 means 200. And that's all you need to run a business.
And why can't these girls leave? One of the mantras that I hear a lot in Canada and in America is that women in prostitution are making a choice. And they say women, not talking about the fact that, as I understand it, most females enter into the sex trade as girls, as minors. They talk about making a choice and say, well, if they don't want to be there, they can leave and let consenting adults do their thing. But I don't think that's really representative of what's going on.
Yeah, choice means different things in different contexts. You and I, when we experience the idea of choice, it's probably from the standpoint of a empowered, safe, secure position. Do I want to do this or that? For many people in the world, choice doesn't exist at all. So, when you have this idea of, the voluntary entry into commercial sexual activity, and I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but what gets overlooked often is the history that came before that, quote unquote, voluntary entry. It could be one of childhood abuse, poverty, other forms of oppression and suffering and violence that make it maybe not so much a choice. And the other thing that people lose track of, and we're talking about the West here. I mean, when you're in grindingly poor parts of the world where you're subjected to daily violence without consequence, it's not a choice at all. It's a desperate flight into another, from the alligator's jaws into the shark's mouth. But the other thing that gets overlooked when we're talking about Western countries is the age of entry. So if you encounter a 25-year-old who says, I'm doing this by choice, it's the lifestyle I have, it's a good whatever. If it started when that person was 14, and that's all they knew, and under most laws, that means from the age of 14 until 17 years, 364 days, it was statutory rape, right? I mean, thousands and thousands of them by that point. And then you turn 18 and it's a choice. So was it ever really? Was there ever a real choice there? And that's what people lose track of, is that age of entry component, because for most it's as a minor.
Yeah.
And I think there's a general well-reasoned understanding that, under 18, and you can quibble whether it should be 18 or 17, and some people mature more quickly than others, whatever. But you draw a line in the sand and say, under a certain age, that's not a choice. And if most people are entering as 14 or 13 or 15-year-olds, and then 8 years later, they encounter the system, whether it's a police officer or an NGO worker, and they say it's a choice. Okay, maybe it is that day, but if it started 10 years earlier, it's hard to see that it was ever really a choice.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, this kind of exploitation, sex trafficking, I want to talk about the cobalt mine situation, the horrific exploitation that's happening there also. But, in terms specifically of sex trafficking, like it's a multi-billion-dollar global industry. And it's actually like it's easy money. I mean, you write about this, of course, like it's like a trafficker can just make money over and over and over and over again from exploiting the same girl or woman. Like it's so easy.
It's the most profitable form of slavery in the history of slavery, because it's an enormous global business. And yes, a driving factor of the economics is that you can sell the same human body 5,000 times. And it's all profit generating transactions. And that's what makes it so enormously profitable. But what's the implied reality in that entire system is, well, it's only possible because there's someone willing to buy that person 5,000 times. And that's the other part of this that gets overlooked is, for any market to exist, you have to have supply, you have to have demand. Yeah. And so we know that there's a supply of millions upon millions of vulnerable, poor, oftentimes completely uneducated, impoverished a population of women and girls, primarily. That's the supply. It's an ever-ready supply for traffickers. But there's the demand side too. And that's this entire culture of, money gives me the right to buy someone. And that's as old as human civilization. That I now somehow have purchased a right of ownership for a period of time over this other person. Right? And that's slavery for millennia. And whether it was the old world Atlantic slave trade where you bought the slave at auction and owned them for their lifetime, or you walk into some brothel in Bangkok or off strip club in Vegas or wherever, and you buy someone for an hour, the mindset is, this is my property now for that hour or that day or whatever. I can do what I want. So that entire multi-billion-dollar global business of commercial sex functions because we have accepted the idea that money gives me a right of ownership over someone to do what I want. And in this case, we know what that means. And it is often almost always involves violence and degradation, because that's what ownership means, right? I can do what I want. So that's another part of this entire global phenomenon that has to be addressed, that we have to get past this idea. I mean, it was written down on paper some time ago that we're supposed to be past this idea that you can buy someone and that gives you a right of ownership over them for some period of time. And we're still not past that, unfortunately.
And, you would think, you would assume that sex trafficking is illegal in this day and age. And yet it's, as we've just discussed, this massive, massive industry, and it's growing bigger and bigger. I mean, what have you encountered any kinds of legal models, legislative models, any kind of approach that could curb that demand, that could sort of, at least, I mean, the idea of stopping the entire industry is very idealistic, of course, but, like make it smaller?
Well, let's first acknowledge that the policy debates in this area are very emotional, very heated, very ideologically driven. And there is generally not agreement on what's the right approach. And it comes back to this idea of choice. If there's such a thing as choosing to do this, that should be preserved. That's a right. Who are you to tell me what I can and can't do, what choices I can and can't make, and so on. But if you adopt the premise that invariably, maybe not, it wasn't a choice for some reason, because it started at 14, or there was a history of childhood abuse, whatever it is, then that's not a right that needs to be protected. In fact, you need to protect against that. And there's a lot of debate and disagreement about that. But to answer your question, I'd say the most promising model out there is the one that hones in on this demand side that we talked about. It's been called the Nordic model, the demand abolition model. And the idea is, okay, if we make commercial sex illegal, the first thing that happens is police target the women and girls on the street corner, because they're easy pickings, and they just get further persecuted and prosecuted and punished. And so that's not the right approach. Why aren't we focusing on these guys rolling up with their cash, adopting this mindset that gives them a right of ownership over another person? Isn't that what we should be targeting? The demand side of the equation? And so it started in Sweden and kind of spread across the Nordic countries. And now, believe it or not, France, Ireland, other places have adopted a similar model, which is, we're not going to worry about the women and girls side of this. We're going to focus on these men who think it's okay to go buy women and girls, or boys and children and whatever, anybody, any human being, that's an acceptable transaction. And we're going to punish them, so that if you get caught trying to buy another person, you get a fine. You may get named and shamed. You may get some prison time. You may get your car impounded. I mean, an array of deterrent kind of punishments. And although people still debate whether this is effective or not, there's a lot of research out there that shows it does have a pretty strong deterrent effect on the demand side, which then disrupts the market. It's not a perfect solution, but in terms of taking policies that don't further punish those already being punished and focus on those who are coming to this transaction, this interaction from the standpoint of entitlement, and money gives ownership, maybe that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that. I've been an advocate of the Nordic model for a long time now, and not very many people have heard of it. Usually when I talk about it, people have never heard of it before. And there was a lot of women that fought for Canada to actually adopt a version of the Nordic model with some success. It's not being, like, we technically have the law. Technically paying for sex in Canada is illegal, but it's not enforced in all the provinces. Justin Trudeau has been under a lot of pressure from pro-legalization activists to repeal that law, so we may be in for another fight. But yeah, I'm glad that you found that model to be successful. From what I've heard, it has been successful in Sweden, for example.
Yeah.
And
there's people, I think there's no, it's the most promising policy approach, because if you put on a policy cap for a moment, you think you have to make choices as a policymaker. You cannot protect everyone's rights equally. You have to make choices. Okay. I mean, like the gun ownership debate in the United States. Children should be protected from being shot up at school. That's a right, that we should protect.
Yep.
And then there's a bunch of people saying, no, my right to have that gun has to be protected at all costs, right? I mean, those are competing rights, and you have to make policy choices. So with this one, there's a policy choice. Do we protect the right of the, by and large, theoretical, but possibly it exists, person who wants to make this empowered choice? Don't tell me what to do with my body. Or protect the rights of the vulnerable, who are invariably, because they started at 14, or they've been trafficked from a poor country, or they're subjected to violence, find themselves in this world where they're being repeatedly abused. And so you have to make a choice as a policymaker. And for me, protect the vulnerable. If you have to make a choice between protecting the empowered voluntary choice maker and the disempowered, involuntary, oppressed person, you choose the latter. Now, what's the right way to go about that? I think it's the demand model. I think it's the most promising. I think it has the most positive results, and there's some good data around it. Others quibble, and they will probably quibble as long as the earth is spinning. But Sweden and its neighbors have some reasonable results to show the world that this is the right approach.
Yeah. So, and another issue that I had not, I don't like to admit this, but it's true. I didn't know what was happening in these cobalt mines at all until I heard you on Rogan. And when I tell people what's going on, they don't believe me. um, I mean, I guess I get that in a way. Like, it is really hard to believe, and the companies will say that what they're doing is ethical, or that they're using clean cobalt, or whatever. But before we get into that, I mean, how did you find out what was going on?
Well, I had no idea myself.
Hmm.
It's tucked away.
Yeah.
It's conveniently and neatly tucked away by design. The heart of the African continent is not a place where there's a lot of light shining. It's a dark, violent, out of sight, out of mind place, and it has been for much of human history. But people were onto this, some years ago, and I remember very distinctly being in Boston, and one of my colleagues who's from Congo said, "Siddharth, there's something going on in the cobalt mines. It's not good. It's in the batteries, and you need to go and look at it, because there's some very horrible things taking place." And I said, "What do you mean? Cobalt? That's a color. What are you talking about batteries?" I had no context at all. And then I started looking into it, and I realized, oh, this is actually a very crucial battery component metal. And it's all coming out of the Congo. And there was some stories from NGOs and the odd journalists that the conditions were horrific. So I thought, yeah, I do need to go and see what's going on. And so I took a little time to establish some ground relationships and plan things so I could go in and do research effectively and safely. And I took that my first of many trips in 2018. And, Megan, so I was at that point 18 years into a journey of documenting slavery and child labor around the world. I'd been to probably 50 plus countries at that point. And when I say that, I mean like the underbelly of 50 plus countries, where some horrible things, dark, grim things are happening. And when I got on the ground and got into my first cobalt mining area, I was shell shocked. I mean, I had never seen that scale and severity of human degradation. And it was like the clock had been dialed back 2.5 centuries. That the people there were being brutalized by a broader economic order that was after their loot, and they could either be slaves and get it out of the ground or get out of the way. And the fact, I mean, I remember where I was standing as these thoughts were just swarming through my mind, and I thought, this is the bottom of of the supply chains that reach up to companies that are worth trillions of dollars. And they're worth trillions peddling gadgets and now cars, all of which, or almost all of which, have cobalt in them. And 3/4 of that world supply of cobalt is coming from places like this in the Congo. How can that be? I mean, we're in the 21st century at this point, where everyone's human rights are equal, and the global economy is supposed to be protecting the bottom of the supply chain. And you hear these statements from companies and CEOs that they ensure that the human rights of everyone in their supply chain are protected and everything's done sustainably. And of course, I believe it. We all believe it. And then you get on the bottom of those you get in the ground in the Congo, and you realize none of it's true. In fact, what's happening is just the latest chapter of colonialism. And that the reason this has become now 5 years later, the primary preoccupation for me, and why I wrote Cobalt Red and tried to get the voices of these people out into the world, is there has never been in the history of slavery or colonialism an instance where there was greater degradation of people at the bottom of a chain that generated more profit at the top of the chain and touched the lives of more people around the world. As you and I, Megan, and everyone listening to us right now, cannot function for 24 hours without cobalt. Our lives are utterly dependent on cobalt, and it's all being scrounged out of the ground by kids, by mothers with babies on their backs, by grindingly poor families for $1 or $2 a day, fed up to companies that project themselves as ethical and good stewards of humanity and the environment. And it's all built on this hypocrisy. And the world, people don't know. I didn't know. If you walk down the street and talk to people, most people won't know. But that's changing now, and it has to keep changing because it's an enormous injustice that needs to be set right.
And tell us what you saw when you got to the Congo. What is actually happening in these mines? How does this work?
So there are, if you look at a map in the southeastern part of the Congo, right along the Zambian border, there's a little arc from a town called Lubumbashi to Kolwezi. It's a little crescent that's about 400 kilometers by 80 kilometers. And that little crescent of Earth holds more reserves of cobalt than the rest of the planet combined. And as a consequence of this scramble to get everyone driving EVs and to get everyone upgrading their phones and gadgets each and every year, they can't get the cobalt out of the ground quickly enough. So that part of the Congo, when you ask, what is it like? What do you see? It's been completely obliterated. The earth has been ripped, gouged, torn apart, millions of trees clear cut, enormous, giant, open pit mine craters. I mean, you can see them from space.
Wow.
10, 20, 30 square kilometers in size. And there are hundreds of them. And all these mines dumping toxic effluents into the air, into the water. So the whole countryside's been contaminated. Mines that are the size of cities, just countryside obliterated. And then you have hundreds of thousands of people digging with their hands, with pickaxes, with strips of rebar, families, mother, father, 3 kids, as young as 6 or 7, all of them scrounging because of this fever at the top of the chain to get cobalt in the batteries. And they can't get it out of the ground quickly enough. So there's this ready-made slave labor force because they're so poor, and they've all been displaced by these huge mines that take entire swaths of countryside, kick everybody out, and now they're living on the fringes in shacks and huts. And the only way to survive is to fill a sack or 2 of cobalt a day. So you'll have young children in trenches and pits, caked in toxic filth, because cobalt is toxic to touch and breathe. You have mothers, young mothers, their babies strapped to their backs, hacking at the ground, all this toxic dust coming up into their lungs, into their babies' lungs. You have an entire part of the planet that's been destroyed in order to facilitate our green transition. And that's the story that doesn't emerge. Yeah. Wait a minute. This push to have EV mandates and transition to electric vehicle fleets in order to save the environment, no protecting the earth for our children and grandchildren. But how can it come at the cost of destroying their part of the planet? Does Africa not count? Do their trees not count the same as ours? Is their water not the same as our water? And how is it that we're charging so fast forward with this transition to EVs that no one's stopping to see, are we trampling on other members of humanity along the way? And that's exactly what's happening. And that's what you see on the ground. It's plain as day. It's right there for anyone to see. And now with Cobalt Red out in the world, you can hear the voices of those people in the Congo telling you directly. It doesn't have to be me. Shouldn't be anyone else acting as an intermediary. The point of my book was there are people here who are looking at an apocalypse that we've caused them to suffer, and they're screaming and no one's listening. And yet we all rely on them every day. So we need to hear what they have to say. And that's the point of the book. And hopefully it will lead to policymakers and consumers just taking a beat and sorting out and setting right the bottom of the chain, rather than just charging forward and not paying attention to the consequence of the people in the Congo.
It's like, it's so hard to hear. It's like, it's so big and it's so upsetting. And I've heard you talk about this before, and I heard you talk about it in the book, but I mean, do these companies know? Sorry. Do these companies know what's going on? Like these EV companies, Apple. I mean, tell me about all the products. I mean, we know about EVs, computers, phones.
I mean, so look, first of all, they all know.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this. If they don't know, then that is the manifestation of such a severe degree of criminal negligence and ignorance that they should all be fired. Every director, CEO should all be fired. If they don't know that there's a precious segment of humanity that's being obliterated every time they hawk their phones and cars at the bottom of their supply chain, if they're not aware of that, then they should all be fired for negligence, or they should just get down into the pits themselves and start digging the cobalt with their own hands. So they all know. You have cobalt in the batteries of pretty much every smartphone, every tablet, every laptop, every e-scooter, e-bike, rechargeable, anything probably has cobalt in the battery. But the real demand is coming from EVs, because an EV battery can require up to 10 plus kilograms of refined cobalt, which is 1,000 times as much as you'd have in a smartphone. Now, in order to meet, COP26, COP27 mandates on numbers of EVs that should be on the road, we're talking hundreds of millions of new EVs on the road by the year 2035, 2050, hundreds of millions. Mm-hmm. Each of them requiring 5, 10, 11 kilograms of refined cobalt. And it all is coming out of Congo. So when I said that there's this fever, there's this scramble that you can't get cobalt out of the ground quickly enough, and that requires this entire population of people to scrimp and scrounge and put themselves in enormous hazard and risk for $1 or $2 a day to get that cobalt up and into the batteries. And the companies all know. They know. They just, here's the thing. The fact that they haven't, none of them, gotten on the ground at the bottom of their supply chains and ensured that the statements they make about protecting human rights in their supply chains, and they all say down to the mining level, they all say down to the mining level. The fact that none of these companies have done nearly enough to actually achieve the things they say they're doing means those people over there don't count.
Yeah.
To them. And so when I said we've dialed the clock back 2.5 centuries, that was slave trade logic. That was colonial thinking. Oh, these people are savages. They don't count. Their nature is to be enslaved. I mean, that's what people said 2.5 centuries ago. And now you have CEOs worth billions, companies worth trillions, all relying on these people and treating them like a brute labor force. Same mindset. They don't count the same. You wouldn't see anybody in Cupertino sending their kids into toxic pits to dig for minerals for $1 a day, but it's okay to send the kids of the Congo.
Right.
And that's what has to be set right. And we have to come to terms with the realities that are implicit in that dynamic, that those people over there still don't count. And when they die, it doesn't count. When they scream, we don't hear. But if we make plenty of money off of them and their resources, it's under their feet. So it's their resources. Then everything's okay.
What excuses do these companies come up with when pressed on this?
They all point their finger downstream. So, an Apple or a Tesla will say, oh, it's up to the battery company. The battery company will say it's up to the mining company. The mining company will say it's up to someone. So everyone's pointing their finger downstream until the last finger is pointed at an 8-year-old boy up to here in toxic grit with a sack of cobalt, earning 50 cents so he can eat. And no one's accepting responsibility for that child. And the simple premise is this: demand for that mineral in that boy's sack starts at the top of the chain. And that's where responsibility has to sit. There are bad actors all the way down at every level, but the entire chain of interest, the entire chain of negative causality only exists because Apple, Tesla, Google, Samsung, Microsoft, on down the list, Daimler, Ford, GM, Tesla, everyone. That whole chain of negative outcomes only exists because of their express demand for the cobalt under that kid's feet. And so it's their responsibility to make sure that that child is in school and his parents are being paid a decent wage and have safety equipment so they're not being contaminated every day. And simple things. Mm-hmm. It would be a rounding error on their balance sheets in terms of resources required to actually eliminate almost all the harm being caused to the people of the Congo. And so you have to return to that same premise. Well, why aren't they doing it?
Yeah. Why not pay higher wages at least?
You wouldn't even notice. Look, these people make $2 a day. If you paid them $10 a day, they'd have food, clothes, and they could keep their children in school. Mm-hmm. And we're only talking about a few 100,000 people. Are you telling me those companies collectively would even notice the difference between a wage of $2 and $10 for a few? They make that in a day. Mm-hmm. It's meaningless money to them, but it means everything to the people in the Congo.
Yeah, it's disgusting. And, the fact that, EVs in particular are framed as this like ethical move is just, it makes me enraged. I mean, Justin Trudeau I think earlier this year, he announced that he was imposing an EV mandate. So by the year 2030, supposedly, I mean, I don't know if this will actually happen because it seems crazy, but this is the mandate that he imposed. 100% of new vehicles had to be EVs. And then around the same time announces that he's putting 1.5 billion into building to collaborating with Volkswagen so that they can have an EV battery factory in Ontario, which, you know, creating new jobs, fighting climate change, so on and so forth. And this is the guy who's selling himself as this really progressive man. He's helping Canadians. He's helping the environment. Nothing, no thought about these kids or these people. Not anything.
No, it's all built on a lie.
Yeah.
It's all built on a hypocrisy. There's nothing inherently wrong with bringing jobs to your community,
No.
with
No.
preserving the environment, with protecting the earth for children and grandchildren. There's nothing inherently wrong in that. But when it's all built on the destruction of another set of people and the destruction of their environment, it's all a lie. It's all a hypocrisy. And that's the injustice that has to be set right. You can't protect your part of the earth by ransacking and destroying another part of the earth. That's not reasonable thinking. It's maybe 300 years ago, it would have been a reasonable way to think. But today, you can't do that. And you cannot treat another set of people and their earth as if it's expendable and disposable. And that's the problem with these mandates. And this push is it has completely ignored the cost and consequence to the people in the heart of Africa.
Yeah. So, I mean, what do we do? What can individuals do?
Well, number one, have conversations like this.
Mm-hmm.
Keep spreading the message. I'm a firm believer in the fact that big change happens through an inevitable sequence of events. The first is truth seekers bring a horror to the attention of the world. People can't change what they don't know about. So step one is bringing the truth of some horror to the attention of the world. And then that spreads. That wave of truth washes over the world. And inevitably, throughout history, the next thing that happens is a community of conscience or multiple communities of conscience form, mobilize, agitate, and then drag everybody else forward with their force of will to set the injustice right. Those will be the leaders who will emerge to set this injustice right. And I don't know who they are yet. They're probably out there starting, agitating, forming, thinking, planning, organizing. And that will happen. But we're still at the phase of bringing this truth to the world. So continue spreading the truth. That's what people can do each and every day. I think also as consumers, because this entire chain of misery is driven towards consumption of products with cobalt in. So as consumers, we have choices to make. Do we need to upgrade our phone every year?
Yeah.
We've been marketed the idea that we need to, but do we really need to? Because every time you do that, you're expressing more demand. You're creating more demand and introducing more demand into the chain, which filters down to that pressure, that fever on the ground of the Congo to get the cobalt out of the ground. So do you need the new phone or gadget each and every year? I think with EVs, people have to make an individual choice. The sad reality is we've all been made unwitting participants in this injustice. And you and I can't fix it by ourselves, but we can make choices in the meantime. And if you want to buy an EV, fine, but then you have to agitate. and push for that chain of violence to be set right, for these injustices to be set right. Or you may say, you know what, I'm going to take a beat and wait until these companies sort out the supply chain. And all these policymakers decide with one hand that they're going to push for these mandates, that there should be no more gas powered sales by the year 2030, 2040, whatever it is. And the other hand, it has to have resources to ensure that the consequences of that mandate aren't violence and harm and environmental destruction in the heart of Africa. And so that means putting money on the ground, boots on the ground, resources on the ground to protect those people and ensure that the demand side pressures created by these policies don't result in enormously negative consequences for people who are already so poor and suffering so much in one of the most violent, war-torn parts of the planet. So you may decide as a consumer, you know, until that happens, until I see that the bottom of the chain has been sorted, I'm not going to buy an EV. If you do, fine, then you have to agitate. You've got to be an agitated consumer and say, look, I'm trying to make a good choice, but I can't plug in my car knowing that every time I do so, some kid in the Congo is dying.
I mean, are there any ethical ways of mining cobalt currently? Is that a thing that exists? I mean, I find just the term artisanal cobalt mining really maddening, because that doesn't mean what it sounds like, right?
No, it's part of the word game and the marketing puffery that is meant to misdirect us from seeing the truth. They use this term artisanal mining in contrast to industrial mining, which means excavators and heavy machinery. And they say, well, if it's not that, then it's artisanal. And what does that mean? Like, it makes you think some people are doing quaint activities or baking bread or something. It's a term that belies the reality, which is it's miserable, hazardous, dangerous, toxic labor. Now, cobalt is mined in a few other places. Not much, but you know, there's some cobalt mined in Australia and Morocco and Russia and some other countries. They provide 3% or so each of the world's supply. And I haven't been there to those places, but I'm sure the conditions are acceptable. They need to be acceptable in the Congo as well. And that's a simple matter of companies at the top of the chain getting on the ground in the Congo and making sure that the people digging their cobalt out of the ground do so in conditions that are decent, safe, and dignified.
Yeah. I mean, again, I can't thank you enough for your work, because I think no one would know what was going on right now with cobalt mining in the Congo if not for your book. And I know that it was really hard work. I mean, I know that it was hard to get to these places, never mind to have to witness what's going on.
If it's a dangerous part of the world, it's heavily militarized. There are soldiers with AK-47s and machetes all over that part of the Congo, oftentimes guarding mines, keeping people out, keeping minerals safe, ensuring that everything that's dug out of the ground by a child ends up right back in the industrial mining companies' pockets and supply. So access is very hard. It's difficult moving around that part of the world. It's pretty dangerous, but the people who are putting their lives at risk are the Congolese people, and they're doing it for almost nothing but base survival income, so that you and I can live our lives. And so, bringing their voices out into the world is the least responsibility that I felt I had, and that's the point of the book. And as I said, I believe fundamentally that people will be moved and get activated to set this right. Generally speaking, most of us have a conscience. Most of us are good people. We don't stand for injustice. We certainly don't want to participate in it. And when we come to learn about it, whatever we can do, I think most people will do.
Right. I think that's true, and I hope that's true. So, again, for those listening, your book is Cobalt Red, of course, and How the Blood of the Congo Powers Our Lives. And you can get it on Amazon. Where else can you find that book?
Pretty much most online booksellers, and it's in bookstores as well. And of course, you can get the audiobook if you want to listen to it while on a jog or on your daily commute.
Yeah, I listened to it on Audible while I was cleaning, while I was walking, on the plane, all sorts of places. It was really great to talk with you. I really appreciate your time. I know you're so busy, so thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan. It was very nice talking with you.
Okay, take care.
Yeah.
Bye bye.